Hello, my name is Sophie and I am the Marketing and Communications Manager at Flowminder. In this short video, we're going to cover the key communications principles you need to apply when working on a mobile phone data initiative, but actually these principles apply for any type of project. So we're going to discuss knowing and understanding your audience, avoiding jargons and acronyms, starting with the why, being transparent, and dedicating the relevant resources. Right. Right. So let's discuss knowing your audience and tailoring your message. So basically, when you're presenting to or communicating to different groups, whether it's a room full of telecom engineers, government official, a meeting with like civil society groups or a PR event to the general public, you need to remember that each group needs different information and that this information needs to be delivered in a way that resonates with them. So if, for example, when you're explaining call detail records or CDRs, you may not present it the same way with the same language and the same story. So, for example, if you're speaking to a telecom engineer, you might talk about timestamped metadata, signal towers. Well, actually, if you're speaking to a non-technical audience, or you're trying to mention the data source, but what really matters is more the purpose. So you're going to say maybe something like, we're using anonymized mobile phone data activity or mobile phone usage data to understand how people move between regions without ever identifying individuals. So it's a similar concept, but you see the language has changed and the angle of the story has changed because they may not care about the same thing or understand the same principles. Right. So to better understand how to communicate with your stakeholders, you need to determine what they need to know and how to engage with them. And there is a tool called a stakeholder matrix, which can be quite handy. And below this video, you can read some of the contents related to these engagement frameworks. The one that you are probably familiar with, because it's the most popular one, is the influence interest matrix. So you categorize your stakeholders between keep satisfied, manage closely, monitor, and keep informed. Basically, what you do is you place each of your stakeholders in the appropriate box. So the stakeholders and audiences that have the highest level of influence and interest should be given the most attention and priority, while the ones that have low influence and low interest can be maybe just kept informed. Right, so the next principle is about avoiding jargons and explaining acronyms. So a term that might be second nature to you can be completely confusing to someone else, and we're guilty of that. So we tend to use a lot of acronyms, but depending on who you speak to, they may not get it. For example, if I say the NSO and the MNO are working with the TRA on CDR analysis, that might make perfect sense to people who work with mobile phone data. But better communications sounds like the National Statistics Office and a major mobile operator are working with the telecom regulator to analyze anonymized mobile phone activity and estimates how people are moving across the country. So basically, a good communication starts with one simple question: who is your audience? So you need to take time to understand who you're speaking to and then tailor your message to their needs, knowledge level, and context. So as we've seen before, understanding your users, and there are different tools, which I'm not going to go into details right now, like user personas, are useful. But what you need to remember in communication is whether they're policymakers, the general public, or technical stakeholders, your language should fit what they expect. Okay, so this core principle is called always start with the why. Actually, you should always start with knowing your audience, and then you consider the why, and you should include the so what. So always starting with the why can look like, why is this project being undertaken? What problem is it solving? What are the expected outcomes? Why does it matter to the public? That's the most important thing. Why does it matter? And then you can ask yourself questions like, how does it help my organization, my community, or the country in general? That will help you to determine the message. So, because when people understand the purpose, they're far more likely to engage and support the work. So, for example, you may want to start your communication with saying, well, actually, what do you do? Well, we process CDRs using spatial clustering and machine learning models and AI and blah, 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 blah. But you may want to start instead with, so we want to understand how people are moving during crisis so we can improve disaster response planning. And this is why blah, 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 blah. So when it's necessary, you get into the technical detail. So this principle is really about making you understand that a simple shift in the structure can increase the clarity and the trust, but also the interest from your users, because people buy the purpose. They don't buy the technical details first. This core principle is about who's involved and also around the aspect that transparency is key. So your communication should clearly explain who's involved in the project. So the different data controllers and processors and partners involved directly in processing, analyzing the data and turning the data into solutions for good. But you should also mention who's being consulted. So the ministries and agencies and users that you're working with, for example, the data protection experts, or if you have a civil society organization you're working with, maybe through a steering committee, they can be part of that communications. But also you need to mention the measures that are in place to protect the data and potentially include the legal basis for using it. But that very much depends on the media output that you're producing. She's not just focusing on the process, but also, as we've said earlier, starting with the why, explaining the benefits. So what this work will enable, how it will improve decision making, and how the public might benefit. So again, transparency will help you to build trust, but it doesn't mean that you've got to list all of these things in every communications. You've got to adjust depending on the purpose, the audience, and their needs and interests. Now let's discuss resources. So that's often overlooked, but dedications need dedicated attention in its planning, resources, and intent. So you have to think about assigning a dedicated communications lead, but also a budget. And you should plan your messaging from the start, not as a final step. So often users think about waiting until they've got results and they have a use case to talk about and maybe some impact. But actually, the earlier you talk about it, you're less likely to have backlash. And the more interest you gauge at the beginning, the more transparent you are, the better it is. In terms of the resources to put in place, you might want to create a small project team. So that could be um, composed of a project manager who obviously understand every aspect of the project, the data experts that can guide around data processing and confidentiality and privacy, etc. And of course, the communication specialist. And all of these people will work together to ensure that every communications output, so whether it's a press release, a data report, an analysis, or a public presentation, is fit for purpose and audience appropriate, but also clear and have all of the principles that we've discussed earlier. Okay, so let's wrap up. The core principles that we have heard about today are knowing your audience, avoiding jargons and explaining acronyms, leading with the why, being sensitive to the context, being transparent about who's involved and what safeguarding measures are in place, clearly communicating the benefits, and finally investing in a dedicated communications team and budget. So if there's one thing to bear in mind is that good communication builds trust. It turns complex data projects into impactful, well-supported initiatives. So I thank you for watching, and I hope that you will keep communicating with clarity and purpose and enjoy the course that we've put together for you.